We're here at Cecilia Brunson Projects to talk about the gallery and also the current exhibition by the leading neo-concrete artist Willys de Castro. So you're originally from Chile and you've been running this gallery for 3 years now, focusing on Latin American artists. What is it particularly about these artists and their works that interests you?
My background is, I'm originally from Chile, but I did most of my career in New York, and there I worked as a curator for Latin American art. So when I came here, I did that switch that a lot of people do not do, which is go from becoming a curator to becoming a dealer. And the reason was it felt like London was the perfect place to do it because there's such a sort of financial hub, and it felt like a lot of very interesting shows were taking place in the commercial galleries rather than, I mean, of course the museums, but there's a lot of interesting things going on in the commercial galleries. The other thing that I noticed was that even though Latin America wasn't a colony of the UK, there was a lot of interest in Latin American art, and a lot of Latin American artists were actually represented by British galleries. However, I realized that the artists that were being represented by London galleries were quite a, very sort of a 0%. So I thought, why don't we build up a space where we can show artists that are in their meat of their careers, and they're very well known in the US and in Latin America. They have very strong trajectories. However, they're not very well known in Europe and not in London. And Willys de Castro is sort of one of the best examples of this scenario. And the reason being because in the 60s there was quite a fascinating moment for Brazilian Venezuelan art here in the UK. It was through a gallery called Signals, and Signals presented for the first time in the United Kingdom these artists that were working within the modern movement, creating this sort of very much contemporary style based on modern abstract and geometric principles, very much sort of avant-garde, and they were presenting these incredibly avant-garde pieces coming out of Latin America in London. Willys de Castro was part of that neo-concrete movement, yet he was never given a show. So it became so evident that this was sort of the missing link from the 60s, and it was quite lovely for the opening of the exhibition because people that had seen those exhibitions in the 60s came to say, I can't believe Willys de Castro has finally shown in London. Also, I think the reason why Willys de Castro perhaps wasn't shown in the 60s was he was very much on his own. He was part of the neo-concrete movement. He was part of the signing of the neo-concrete movement in 1959, and very much Brazil's main cities for the sort of modern movement, the invention of the concrete and the neo-concrete, took place in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And the movements are divided depending on which city you lived in. Yeah, the Cariocas of Rio de Janeiro, you can imagine them, they were sort of much more sort of jazzy and playful with this inherited material from modernist Europe. And the Paulistas, the people that lived in São Paulo, were more sort of gestalt, simple forms, and just sort of playing with these sort of different kind of geometric possibilities. But Willys de Castro is at the crux of it because he's in São Paulo while all this is happening, and he moves to Rio de Janeiro to sign the 1959 Rio Concrete Movement. So he's everywhere, yet he's pretty much on his own. And I think that's one of sort of his very sort of interesting things in his practice. He was a graphic artist. He did theatre. Did painting, design. He was a bit of like peripatetic, did absolutely everything, at once.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're focusing specifically on works from 1953 to 61. What's special about that period?
That's a good question. Yeah. So basically, it's sort of the early stages of this moment in art history where artists came up with a problem, with an aesthetic problem. And Willys de Castro does that transition of moving from painting to sculpture, what we called, but it's really from painting to sculpture by rethinking this idea of what is an object. Mm-hmm. What is fascinating about Willys de Castro that distinguishes him also from the minimalist in America, because here we're at sort of a crux moment where painting becomes object, is that, like the minimalist, left painting behind in order to just focus on sculptural objects without sort of, oil on canvas. Yeah. What Willys de Castro does, which is actually quite extraordinary and makes these objects very sort of beautiful, is that he sticks with painting and the problems of painting, which are strictly pictorial and have to do with the viewer's perception of how I perceive a work of art that is a painting. So the Objeto Ativo is they're made of oil on canvas on wood. Okay. So when you look at it, you think, oh, it's just a sort of a bit of wood on the wall. It's an object, it's a sculpture, it's an installation, I don't know what it is. But it is both a painting and an object and a sculpture. And as I was saying earlier, one of the things about it is that in order to grasp fully the piece, the viewer needs to actively move around it in order to understand where that vantage point is, which really doesn't exist.
Because there's no point at which you can get a grasp of the whole object at once.
Absolutely. So I think that's the key invention of Willys de Castro that he gave to art history, is that everybody wanted to create in the 60s a viewer that was participatory. Lydia Clark invented the vichos, where you had to sort of pick them up and open them up. Jugula Kosice from Argentina had the rolli, which is the same thing. The viewer could come into the space, move it, and create a certain subjectivity. This is how I feel and how I want this object to look. In the case of Willys, it's also a perceptual and mental game where the viewer doesn't have to sort of hold the piece, but the viewer needs to engage phenomenologically with the body and move around the work, creating this sort of active viewer. Yeah, so it's sort of one of the wonderful things of the brain and the mind and, perception, yeah.
He also, talking of the brain and the mind, he also works with poetry.
Yes, so he was, a concrete poet, right. And he was part of the concrete poetry movement. And I think one of the loveliest things about it is that they're also quite spatial. So if you look at the poems here in the exhibition and you read down, 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 deep, down, deep, down, deep, 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 you almost go down with that poem. And that's one of the things about also the hanging of the show, is that the poem is placed on the wall underneath. Yes. So, because he's really thinking about it not only poetically but spatially, and sort of we helped that work to manifest itself in the sort of multiple dimensions. So they're quite simple, but they're evocative and they're sort of brainy but emotional. So we're really pleased that we were also able to bring that aspect of his work into the exhibition. Yes.
And what do you think is the main relevance of his work to artists today or to audiences today?
I think that it is a key example of this moment in history where there's an invention and there is a breakthrough that is both visually, materially and philosophically, yet done in a very simple way.